a tiny cradle, a silent infant, and an empire trembling with whispers. In the royal palace of Tang Dynasty, China, a newborn princess was found lifeless, her breath stolen before she could even cry. At her side was her mother, Zetian. But instead of the tears of a grieving parent, there was cold composure. Some whispered the unthinkable, that Wu had strangled her own child with her bare hands, not out of madness, but out of calculation. By placing blame on a rival, she could eliminate those who stood in her way and climb closer to the throne. This was not tragedy, it was strategy. The court was horrified. To accuse an empress of murder was scandalous enough. To imagine that a mother would kill her own baby defied every moral code of Chinese society, and yet no one dared confront her directly. Evidence was scarce, suspicion was everywhere, and Wu played her role as the heartbroken mother so flawlessly that even the emperor himself turned against her enemies. But the question remains, how does a concubine, a woman meant to remain in the shadows of history, rise to become the only female emperor China has ever known? How did she turn love into a weapon, motherhood into a tool, and betrayal into a throne? This is the beginning of a story soaked in blood and ambition, where every bond, even family, could be sacrificed for power. Wu Zetian's rise would defy tradition, silence rivals, and rewrite the very laws of history. And it all began with a death in the cradle. Roots of a tyrant, Wu Zetian's story began far from the glittering halls of the imperial palace. She was born in 624 AD, during the height of the Tang Dynasty, a golden age of Chinese culture, trade, and power. Her family, the Wu clan, was wealthy, respected, and well-connected. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a successful timber merchant who later became a military officer. Her mother belonged to a prominent aristocratic family. In short, Wu was not born into obscurity. She was born into privilege, with doors already open to her. But what truly set her apart was not wealth. It was education. In Tang Dynasty China, daughters were rarely taught anything beyond domestic skills. Most girls were expected to be silent, obedient, and useful only as wives and mothers. Wu's father, however, believed in sharpening her mind. From an early age, she was taught to read, to write, and to debate, the very skills that defined scholars and officials in the imperial court. It was unheard of. While other young girls embroidered silk, Wu studied classical Chinese literature, history, and political philosophy. She read the Confucian texts that outlined strict rules for women's obedience, and she learned exactly how to break them. She trained in calligraphy, a highly respected art among elites, and practiced poetry, which she used to charm and impress others later in life. Those around her noticed something unusual. Wu wasn't simply intelligent, she was shrewd. Even as a child, she learned to bend conversations to her advantage. Relatives described her as sharp-tongued yet persuasive. Servants whispered that she could make adults obey her with nothing but her words. She had charisma far beyond her years. There are even legends that as a young girl, Wu would practice controlling animals, training horses with an iron will and an unflinching hand, a metaphor for how she would later control men and empires. She was not content to stay within the narrow boundaries society built for women. She studied how people behaved, how they were manipulated, and how they could be dominated. By the time Wu was a teenager, it was clear. She was no ordinary girl. She had the education of a scholar, the charm of a court entertainer, and the ruthless ambition of a general. To her parents, she was a gifted daughter. To history, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a woman who would one day challenge the greatest power in the world. Her journey from privileged daughter to imperial concubine was about to begin. And once she entered the palace, the lessons she had learned as a child, intelligence, charm, manipulation, would become her deadliest weapons. A girl in the dragon's den. At the age of just 13, Wu Zetian stepped into a world few could even imagine. The imperial palace of Emperor Taizong, the most powerful man in China. She did not enter as a princess or a noble consort. She entered as a Cairen, a low-ranking concubine, one among hundreds of women chosen to serve, entertain, and perhaps bear children for the Son of Heaven. The Tang court was dazzling on the surface, filled with golden halls, silken robes, and refined poetry. But beneath the glitter was a pit of venom. The palace was a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of whispers, alliances, and betrayals. Women competed ruthlessly for the emperor's attention. Ministers schemed against each other to gain power. A single mistake, a careless word, could end a life. Wu Zetian was not the emperor's favorite. Taizong, already in his 40s, had many women and trusted advisors. To him, Wu was just another concubine in a sea of faces. But this may have been her greatest advantage, because while others fought openly for his attention, Wu did something different. She watched, listened, and learned. In the court, she observed the subtle art of survival. She noticed how ministers bowed too deeply when they were hiding secrets. She saw how one concubine's jealousy could turn into her downfall. She learned which generals had the emperor's trust and which officials lived in constant fear. She absorbed the rhythms of palace life, the way a hawk studies its prey, silently, patiently, without rushing. Unlike many concubines, Wu was well-educated. She used this to her advantage. When she was allowed to converse with the emperor, she impressed him with her knowledge of history and statecraft. Taizong was known as a pragmatic ruler who respected talent, and Wu ensured he saw her as intelligent, not just beautiful. She even assisted him with paperwork, reading official reports, and offering small but sharp observations, unusual for a concubine of her rank. And then there was her fearless personality. One famous anecdote tells of Wu volunteering to tame a horse that no one else dared ride. She tied a stick across its mouth, whipped it into submission, and rode it fearlessly before the emperor. Taizong was stunned. This was no timid girl. This was someone with iron nerves and the will to dominate. Still, Wu remained in the shadows of the palace. She was not yet powerful. She had no children with Taizong, no official rank beyond concubine. To many, her life at court seemed destined to fade into obscurity. But in truth, Wu was studying the architecture of power itself. Every betrayal, every secret, every glance in the throne room became a lesson. She was learning how emperors ruled and how ministers manipulated them. She was memorizing the weaknesses of the system, preparing herself for a future no woman had ever dared imagine. While other concubines dreamed of being noticed, Wu Zetian dreamed of something far greater, to seize the throne itself. From nun to seductress. In 649 AD, Emperor Taizong, the ruler Wu Zetian had served since childhood, died. According to tradition, concubines who had not borne the emperor children were deemed useless to the dynasty. They could not remarry. They could not remain at court. Instead, they were sent away to Buddhist temples, condemned to spend the rest of their lives as nuns, fading into obscurity behind monastery walls. Wu, just 25 years old, shaved her head, donned the plain robes of a nun, and disappeared from the palace that had been her battlefield. To most, this was the end of her story. But for Wu Zetian, it was only an intermission. Even in the isolation of the temple, Wu's ambition burned. She refused to accept a life of chanting prayers and sweeping courtyards. She had spent over a decade observing power, memorizing every detail of court politics, and she knew her time would come again. Her chance arrived through an unlikely connection. Li Ji, better known as Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's ninth son and the new ruler of China. Years earlier, when Wu had been a concubine in Taizong's palace, the young prince had noticed her. Their encounters had been brief, but Wu never forgot the look in his eyes. Now, as Gaozong ascended the throne, Wu made sure he remembered her too. From the quiet halls of the monastery, Wu began to reignite his interest. Through carefully crafted letters and whispered messages delivered by temple visitors, she reminded him of her beauty, her wit, and her loyalty. Gaozong, known for his weakness and indecision, was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. And then came the scandal. Gaozong did what no emperor had dared before. He brought Wu Zetian back into the palace. This was no ordinary recall. Wu had been his father's concubine. For a son to take his father's woman was considered not just immoral, but incestuous and politically explosive. The court erupted in outrage. Ministers and officials condemned it as shameful, unnatural, a violation of sacred tradition. But Gaozong ignored them all. Wu had ensnared him completely. She returned to the palace not as a forgotten widow, but as a woman with a purpose. She was more mature, more calculating, and far more ambitious than before. Back within the golden halls, she began her ascent anew. This time she was not a timid girl watching from the shadows. She was a seasoned survivor who had endured exile, disgrace, and the threat of obscurity, and had come back stronger. Wu Zetian was no longer just a concubine. She was a seductress, a strategist, and a woman who had defied death itself to reclaim her place in the game of power. And for those who still dared to underestimate her, she was about to show just how dangerous she could be. The palace games begin. When Wu Zetian returned to the imperial palace, the scandal of her recall soon gave way to something far more dangerous: her rapid rise in the heart of power. Emperor Gaozong, weak-willed and prone to indecision, was captivated by Wu almost instantly. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. Unlike other concubines who relied only on looks or charm, Wu combined intelligence, ambition, and an uncanny ability to read people. She studied Gaozong's insecurities, his desires, and his fears, and she used them all to her advantage. Soon, the emperor's attention shifted away from the two most powerful women in his life: Empress Wang, his official wife, and Consort Xiao, his longtime favorite companion. Both women had spent years securing their influence. Both were furious at Wu's sudden return. But Wu didn't compete with them in the usual way. She didn't fight openly for the emperor's affection. Instead, she positioned herself as indispensable, not just in the bedroom, but in the council chamber. Whenever Gaozong faced a difficult decision, Wu was there with carefully chosen words. She whispered in his ear, shaping policies, offering advice, and making him believe the ideas were his own. Ministers began to notice that the emperor's tone, once uncertain, now carried Wu's confidence. Behind the silk curtains of the palace, Wu was quietly writing imperial decrees with her voice. Her rivals were horrified. Consort Xiao mocked Wu as an upstart, a shameless seductress. Empress Wang tried to have Wu removed, warning Gaozong that she was dangerous, but Wu was always 2 steps ahead. Instead of responding with open hostility, she perfected the art of subtle manipulation. She smiled, played the role of the obedient concubine, and let her enemies underestimate her. And while they underestimated her, she gathered allies. Servants who carried secret messages, eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor, ministers who saw an opportunity to rise with her. All were carefully drawn into Wu's orbit. Soon, she had built a web of influence that stretched across the palace. But rivalry in the Tang court was not a game of smiles alone. It was a battle for survival. For Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, Wu's growing dominance was not just an insult. It was a direct threat to their lives and status. The tension grew unbearable. Accusations flew in whispers through the palace halls. Ministers debated in secret, some siding with Wu, others desperate to stop her. The emperor, besotted and blinded, refused to hear a word against her. Wu's position was no longer simply that of a concubine. She was becoming the center of gravity in the empire, and the court knew it. For Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, the choice was clear: destroy Wu before she destroyed them. But Wu Zetian was no ordinary rival. She was patient, ruthless, and willing to cross lines that no one else dared approach. And soon, her ambition would spill from whispers into blood. Murder in the Cradle. The rivalry between Wu Zetian, Empress Wang, and Consort Xiao had reached a boiling point. The palace was divided into factions, whispers filled the corridors, and every glance carried suspicion. But Wu understood something her rivals didn't. In a court ruled by tradition, there was one weapon stronger than beauty, stronger even than political allies: a child. In the year 654 AD, Wu Zetian gave birth to a daughter. For a concubine, this was a turning point. A royal child, even a girl, secured a mother's place in the emperor's heart. Gaozong was overjoyed. To him, the birth was a sign that Wu's place in the palace was blessed by heaven. But within just a few months, tragedy struck. The infant was found dead in her crib, strangled. The palace froze in shock. Servants whispered, courtiers panicked, and Gaozong was devastated. Who could commit such a crime? Wu Zetian wasted no time. Through tears and fury, she accused Empress Wang, the emperor's official wife. According to Wu, jealousy had driven Wang to kill the baby. To Gaozong, already infatuated with Wu, the accusation was devastating. He believed her without hesitation. But beneath the surface, a darker story began to spread. Some believed Wu herself had killed her daughter, a horrifying act of cold-blooded calculation. By sacrificing her own child, she could frame Empress Wang and remove her most powerful rival. Historians still debate this moment. Was it truly Empress Wang's crime, or was it Wu's masterstroke of manipulation? Regardless of the truth, Wu played her role flawlessly. She presented herself as the grieving mother, weeping in public, lamenting her loss with a performance so convincing that few dared question it. Gaozong, blinded by rage, lashed out at those accused. The result was catastrophic for Wu's enemies. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao, once untouchable figures at court, were stripped of their titles and humiliated before the empire. Their factions crumbled overnight. Ministers who had supported them were silenced. Servants who had whispered their names in admiration now bowed to Wu. This single incident, whether by fate or by design, shattered the balance of power. In one swift move, Wu Zetian transformed herself from an ambitious concubine into the empire's most formidable woman. But she wasn't finished. Wu did not simply want her rivals weakened. She wanted them destroyed, and the baby's death was only the first step toward their annihilation. The brutal purge for Empress Wang and Consort Xiao. Losing their titles should have been the end of their power. But Wu Zetian was not content with humiliation alone. She understood something vital about survival in the Tang court. Rivals who live can rise again. To secure her future, she would erase them completely. What followed was one of the most notorious purges in Chinese imperial history. Zetian had both Empress Wang and Consort Xiao imprisoned. At first, courtiers believed they might be sent into exile, perhaps confined to a remote palace as disgraced women. But Wu had darker plans. According to court chronicles, the two women were subjected to torture and mutilation. Their limbs were hacked off, their faces disfigured, their screams echoing behind palace walls. Then, in an act so horrifying it became legend, their bodies were thrown into great wine jars, once vessels of celebration, now turned into coffins of agony. The message was unmistakable. Wu was telling the entire court, "Defy me, and your fate will be worse than death." Fear spread like wildfire. Ministers who had once opposed her suddenly went silent. Servants lowered their eyes and avoided speaking her name. Even members of the royal family tread carefully. Wu's cruelty was not hidden. It was deliberately displayed as a warning. But brutality was only half of her strategy. Wu also ordered their names and records to be erased from official history. In the Confucian worldview, being forgotten was a fate even worse than execution. To strip someone's legacy was to kill them twice, once in body and once in memory. With Empress Wang and Consort Xiao destroyed, the throne was clear. Gaozong, besotted and utterly dependent on Wu, elevated her to the position of Empress Consort, the highest rank a woman could hold in the empire. This was more than a title. It was the recognition that Wu Zetian now stood above every other woman in China. She had fought not only with charm and intelligence, but with blood, terror, and ruthless precision. The palace, once filled with rivalries and factions, now bent to a single figure, Wu Zetian. Her rise had cost lives, and perhaps even her own child, but she had won. And with power finally in her hands, Wu was ready to show China that her ambition had no limits. The puppet emperor. By the mid-660s, Emperor Gaozong's health began to fail. He was plagued with crippling migraines, dizziness, and failing eyesight. Symptoms historians now believe were likely the result of a series of strokes. The Son of Heaven, once the center of the empire, was bedridden, weak, and unable to govern effectively. But where most empresses might have withdrawn into silence, Wu Zetian seized her moment. While Gaozong lay behind silk curtains, Wu began to sit in on court sessions, read government memorials, and issue decrees in his name. At first, she presented herself as a dutiful wife helping her ailing husband. But soon, it became clear. She was not just assisting him, she was replacing him. In council meetings, ministers were stunned to find Wu correcting their reports, questioning their decisions, and delivering orders with authority. The emperor's seal might have still been stamped on documents, but the voice behind those decisions was Wu's. Resistance, however, was dangerous. Those who dared oppose her quickly vanished. Some were dismissed from their posts, stripped of lands and titles. Others were exiled to remote provinces where few survived. A few simply disappeared into the palace dungeons, never to be seen again. At the same time, Wu rewarded loyalty lavishly. Generals who supported her were given command of armies. Scholars who praised her wisdom found themselves promoted. Eunuchs and servants who carried out her will gained unprecedented power. She built a network of absolute loyalty, a shadow government that answered only to her. Court officials soon realized the truth. The emperor was no longer the one they were serving. Gaozong was nothing more than a puppet, a fragile figurehead whose strings were pulled by his wife. Ministers began addressing their petitions directly to Wu, knowing Gaozong would not read them without her. Behind the silken screens of the throne room, whispers began to circulate. Had Wu bewitched the emperor? To some, it seemed unnatural that a woman could dominate the ruler of China so completely, but others knew better. There was no sorcery here, only intelligence, ambition, and ruthless willpower. By the time Gaozong's illness grew worse, the court had already adapted. Decisions were Wu's, policies were Wu's, punishments and rewards, Wu's. The emperor still wore the dragon robes, but it was Wu Zetian who wielded the dragon's claws. China, once ruled by emperors, was now being ruled by an empress in all but name, and Wu had no intention of stopping there. Family ties severed in blood. For Wu Zetian, power was never negotiable, not even within her own family. By the late 660s, she had become the true ruler of China. Ministers obeyed her. Generals followed her orders. Even the emperor himself was her puppet. But there was one threat she could not silence so easily: her own son. Li Hong, her eldest, had been named Crown Prince, the heir to the throne. At just 23, he was everything the empire hoped for in a future emperor: intelligent, compassionate, and deeply respected. He embraced Confucian values of fairness, mercy, and stability. But most dangerously, he often disagreed with his mother. Li Hong began challenging Wu's harsh punishments. He opposed her growing influence in court, attempting to push her loyalists aside. To the ministers, this was the natural confidence of a crown prince preparing to rule. But to Wu Zetian, it was rebellion. Then, in 675 AD, tragedy struck. Li Hong fell suddenly ill. Physicians rushed to his chambers, but none of their remedies worked. Within days, the young prince was dead. Officially, the cause was recorded as a mysterious illness, but behind closed doors, whispers spread. Wu Zetian had poisoned her own son. The timing was too convenient, the motive too clear. To many in the court, there was no doubt. The message was terrifying. If even Wu's own blood could be sacrificed for power, then no one was safe. And Li Hong was not the last. Her next son, Li Xian, briefly became crown prince. At first he appeared loyal, but soon he too began to push back against his mother's dominance. He questioned her cruelty and sought independence. Wu responded swiftly. He was accused of treason, stripped of his title, and banished. Some say he was forced to commit suicide in exile. Another son, Li Jie, was placed on the throne under her watchful eye. But when he showed signs of independence, she removed him too. Over and over, Wu installed her sons as emperors or princes, only to discard them when they threatened her control. By the time she was done, only her weakest and most obedient sons survived. They were not heirs in any true sense. They were puppets, chosen precisely because they posed no danger to her rule. In a culture where motherhood was sacred, Wu Zetian shattered every expectation. She was no longer simply an empress or even a mother. She had become something else entirely, a ruler for whom family ties meant nothing, and blood was just another tool of power. The palace grew colder with each death and disappearance. Ministers trembled, children feared their mother, and even whispers of succession were dangerous. Wu Zetian had shown the empire her ultimate truth. Loyalty was rewarded, disobedience was punished, and not even her own children were untouchable. Her throne was drenched, not only in the blood of rivals, but in the blood of her own sons. The road to the throne. By the late 670s, Wu Zetian's grip on the empire was absolute. But unlike emperors who relied on armies alone, Wu understood that true power required something more: eyes and ears everywhere. She built one of the most feared institutions in Chinese history, a network of spies and secret informants. Eunuchs, palace maids, even government clerks became her agents, reporting whispers, suspicions, and rumors directly to her. No word spoken in the capital was safe. No conversation in the palace was private. Even family members could not trust one another. Her secret police were given terrifying authority. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be interrogated, tortured, or executed, often without trial. Ministers who muttered against her vanished overnight. Courtiers learned quickly that silence was survival. At the same time, Wu rewarded loyalty with unprecedented generosity. Ambitious young scholars were elevated to high office. Generals who pledged themselves to her cause were showered with riches. She built a new ruling class of loyalists, men who owed everything to her and who would rise and fall by her command. While Emperor Gaozong grew weaker, crippled by illness and reduced to a ceremonial figure, Wu became the empire's true ruler. She attended court meetings, issued decrees, signed documents, and shaped every corner of policy. Even foreign envoys who came to the Tang court knew that the Empress, not the Emperor, held the reins of power. By the time Gaozong died in 683 AD, there was no question left. Zetian had already been ruling for years. His death did not create a power vacuum. It merely confirmed what everyone already knew. Wu was the empire's de facto sovereign. But Wu was not content with ruling through shadows or titles like Empress Dowager. She had something far more dangerous in mind, something unthinkable in Chinese tradition. For thousands of years, the throne of the dragon had belonged only to men. Women could advise, influence, or even manipulate, but never rule outright. Zetian was preparing to break that rule. Piece by piece, death by death, she had destroyed every rival, silenced every critic, and bent the empire to her will. Now, she stood on the edge of history, ready to do what no woman had ever dared: to seize the dragon throne itself. Her rise had begun with whispers, betrayal, and the death of a child. It had continued through torture, exile, and the blood of her own sons. And now, with the empire at her feet, Zetian was ready to crown herself not as empress, but as emperor of China. But if her rise had been built on blood, what horrors awaited in her final reign? The conclusion: Zetian had done the impossible. She had risen from a forgotten concubine to the throne of China itself, higher than any woman in the nation's history. She had silenced rivals, erased enemies, and even sacrificed her own children to secure her power. But this was only the beginning. For all the blood she had spilled to rise, the empire had not yet seen the darkest face of her reign. What happens when the most ruthless woman in China's history no longer has anyone left to challenge her? When paranoia replaces ambition and fear consumes the empress who once consumed the empire? The answer lies in her final chapter, a story of spies, terror, betrayal, and death. Join us in Part 2, Zetian's Final Days, Untold Horrors.